Hello everyone, welcome to week 4. This is the last module in the first section, and we'll be focusing on terrorism and terrorist methods, patterns, and trends. Now this topic could probably be an entire course unto itself, but we'll do our best with it this week. The chapter in the book is pretty short, so I supplement it with several readings. Be sure to read all the material for this week. And if you check out any of the publicly available terrorism databases, you can get a good idea of the types of methods used to carry out terrorist attacks. Because just about all definitions of terrorism contain some reference to violence. What you will find are a variety of violent methods used to commit terrorist events. Of all those methods and tactics that terrorists may use, suicide bombing presents special challenges to study and predict because obviously successful bombers are not around anymore to be interviewed. So because of this, researchers and law enforcement are forced to study unsuccessful bombers and then the writings, manifestos, whatever is left behind by successful bombers. Another problem, and admittedly this is a problem with all terrorism research, is that sample sizes are small. There aren't a lot of people that participate in suicide bombing. So it's difficult to really draw conclusions when sample sizes are small. But even though sample sizes are small, researchers have inferred that suicide bombing is a social process, and the use of criminological theories may be appropriate for studying suicide bombing. Another study found that suicide bombers have commonly suffered some type of personal trauma, personal frustrations, that they commit bombings for ideological reasons and because of other social pressures. Then, because they've suffered this trauma or frustration, they'll seek out an organization that is similar ideologically to that of the potential bomber, and joining a group like that helps them to feel significant, where maybe they may not feel significant in their personal lives. So the organization provides the means and the ends for that. We also know that religion does play a role in suicide bombing. However, it may not be as big of a role as what we tend to believe. A study in 2008 found that 85% of suicide bombings were done for secular organizations. So especially today, we commonly associate suicide bombing with radical Islamic terrorists, but most suicide bombings are actually not for religion. The two readings at the end of the chapter both deal with suicide bombing, so be sure to read each of them. There's also 4 additional readings in Blackboard. One is a more general discussion of terrorist weapons, targets, and tactics. One deals with the evolution of suicide terrorism, and the other 2 deal with religion and terrorism. So I'll begin with the first, more general article by Lafree, Dugan, and Miller entitled Terrorist Weapons, Targets, and Tactics. So this article basically starts out with just kind of a description of the types of weapons used by terrorists. And while they use a wide range of weapons, by far the most common ones are explosives and firearms, which means essentially that terrorists are using the most readily available types of weapons generally to carry out their attacks. And these 2 categories alone account for 88% of all attacks. They then go on to discuss how the 4 main weapons identified, explosive, firearms, incendiary devices, and melee, are distributed throughout certain regions of the world, and then also over time. All 4 of these main types of weapons were used across all 13 regions described in the Global Terrorism Database. And then also explosives and firearms are consistently the most frequently used weapons over time as well. So then I moved on from weapons to talk more about targets of terrorism. So be sure to read and understand how they categorized attacks prior to looking at the tables included in the article. They found that private citizens and property were the most commonly attacked target, followed by businesses, the government, the police, military targets. So overall, there were 21 different categories of targets identified by the GTD, with one category, other, as this kind of catch-all for those things that could not really be categorized. Unlike the use of weapons, that were found across all the regions. The target type was much more region specific. So be sure to look and see how all those were distributed. And then also, unlike weapons, the most common type of target changed over time. All right, so then they went on and they discussed, terrorist tactics. Most common tactic is a bombing or explosion followed by armed assault. And that makes sense if you think about what the most common types of weapons were used. And those two account for about 73% of all attacks. Now, not surprisingly, the type of attack used varied across regions of the world. Because you have different groups that are spread across regions of the world, and particular groups may favor particular kinds of tactics. Over time, those results remain fairly consistent, with the top 4 terrorist tactics remaining fairly consistent. So that kind of sums up Lefree, Dugan, and Miller. Next article is by Petizur and Martin, and discussed kind of the evolution of suicide attacks. And I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this article, but be sure to read it. The article essentially discussed how our understanding of suicide terrorism has evolved over time, and what the various challenges have been and still exist to studying and understanding this phenomenon of suicide terrorism. Understanding the issues presented in this article can help with future understanding as we continue to read more articles and you hear some of the same types of terminology used as we progress through the class. All right, the next article is by Hoffman, and this article discusses religious terrorism. And I know it's a little bit older, but there's some good stuff in here. He spends most of the time in this article kind of discussing various religious terrorist groups and then kind of comparing them to each other. But one part of this reading that I want to highlight is this discussion of religious and secular terrorism. One of the really important points that he makes is that even though many of the terrorist groups that claim to be religious groups, they have mostly secular aims, right? Most of their things that they're trying to accomplish are actually secular in nature rather than religious. And this is another point made by Juergensmeyer in his book, Terror in the Mind of God. So if you ever get a chance to read that book, that's one of the main things that he says as well. These groups have secular motivations, but use religion as the justification for those motivations. But what is interesting is if you look at the differences between what a purely religious terrorist group would be and what a purely secular group would be, not these ones that are kind of a combo, but if you separate them out purely. So for religious terrorists, violence is a sacred act or a divine duty done in response to some kind of theological or ideological demand. Okay, and because religious terrorism is this transcendental thing, they're not restricted by political, moral, or practical constraints. Okay, secular terrorists, on the other hand, are, and they consider indiscriminate violence to be counterproductive to what they're trying to do. And they believe this because secular terrorists attempt to appeal to sympathizers and those members of the community that they say they are defending or the ones that they are speaking for. So secular terrorists rely on public support, whereas purely religious groups really don't, because they really don't concern themselves with their audience. Secular terrorists also view the use of violence as only a way to instigate change in a flawed system. The system is inherently good, but there's problems with it. So they use violence as a way, when needed, to instigate change in the system, while religious terrorists see themselves more as the means to destroy whatever system is in place and then replace that system with something that benefits themselves and other adherents to their religion. All right, so the final article is by Forrest. Forrest does a good job of identifying and discussing some of the main religious terrorist groups across the world. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this article either here, but it's really good for explaining who different groups are and what they're trying to accomplish. All right, so that kind of wraps up for this week. Obviously, I didn't have time to go into great detail on a lot of the readings. After you get into these readings, you'll see that I could probably have made a separate 15 to 20 minute video for each of them, but that would have been too much, probably for both of us. So there's a lot of good information in the readings, so please take time to read each of the articles in their entirety. And again, this is the last section of the last week of section 1. And then we'll be moving into section 2 next week. So be sure to complete your discussion board. And as always, I'll see you next week. And please let me know if you have questions.